Welcome to episode 4 of Globalization, Global Brands and Branding. In part 1 of this episode, we'll be comparing Made in China with Make in India. At the end of episode 3, we made a couple of quick points that for most of recorded history, say up till about the 16th century, India and China were the dominant economic powers in the world in terms of GDP, with China contributing around 25% of the world's GDP and India 33%. In the year or the century, 16th century, 17th century, is when colonization by Europe of the rest of the world began, and specifically India and China, at which point in time, if you see the graph here, the dotted line shows you the 16th century period when their colonization began, and you can also see that the GDP of India and China starts shrinking and that of European, the colonizing nations, starts increasing. This trend was accentuated further because of industrialization. Europe was heavily industrialized thanks to the discovery of the internal combustion engine, and this caused the European nations to use their colonies, especially India and China, as markets for mass-produced products in Europe. The result was that India and China both became the world's largest markets, which they still are. At that time, you can see a rapid shrinkage in the GDP share of India and China, and an increase in that of European nations. This went on till the end of World War II, around which time colonization ended. India became independent in 1947, China at around the same time. Both of them took about 2 or 3 years to get their governance in place. India became a republic in 1950. China went through a very bloody revolution in 1949, led by Chairman Mao. At that time, is when the real climb began in the 1950s. And at the end of this graph, you can see that both India and China's GDP is increased, but China's has increased substantially. It's almost 2.5 times that of India. Moving on to 2019, the gap we saw between India and China's GDP has now increased, and it's almost twice as much. India's GDP at about 3 trillion USD, and China's at around 15 trillion USD. In fact, China has now got the second highest GDP, the highest being the US, which is at about $20 trillion. Now, one interesting point before we move on is why is it that if India and China rank higher than some of the G7 nations in terms of GDP, why are they not in the G7, which is the group of the most evolved economies? And the reason is simple. They're huge populations at about 1.3 to 1.4 billion each on a per capita basis. India's GDP is around 2,300 US dollars. China's is around 10,000 US dollars. Compare that to Italy, the G7 nation with the lowest per capita GDP, around 33,000 US dollars, or the US, which has the highest per capita GDP of around 65,000 US dollars. So I keep mentioning the G7 nations for obvious reasons. One is very high GDP per capita, and more relevant to the subject of brands is the fact that more than 90 of the world's 100 most powerful global brands come from these 7 nations alone. I have explained in great detail how building strong brands helps build a strong economy, but let me make the point once again. And this time I'm going to use Interbrands criteria for defining what a global brand is. 1. 70% of the brand's revenues must come from outside the home country. 2. It must be present in at least 3 major continents. 3. No more than 50% of the brand's revenues should come from any one continent. 4. It must have broad coverage in both developed as well as emerging markets. But what makes a global brand strong enough to rank in Interbrand's top 100 list? Now, brand strength comes basically from the preference of consumers. A, how many consumers buy it versus competing brands, and B, how much more are consumers willing to pay for such a preferred brand. The point is that despite being priced higher than most competing two-wheeler brands in almost every country across the world, Honda outsells each one of them globally, which is why it has featured regularly in Interbrand's list for over a decade. In fact, in Interbrand's list, there are 5 Japanese brands that have emulated Honda's example for almost a decade. And when it comes to Germany, there are 7 brands that this nation contributes. No wonder then that both of these nations are some of the wealthiest in the world in terms of per capita GDP. If your brand is in high demand, your exports are high, the chances are you will have what is called a favorable balance of trade, which means you'll export more than you'll import. You will have a stronger GDP, a stronger per capita GDP, and therefore a better standard of living for your citizens. Back to brands and India and China. China was the first between the two nations to put one of its brands in Interbrand's top 100 list. And that was way back in 2014. And that brand was Huawei. In that year, in 2014, it was ranked 94. And today, in the latest report, it ranks at about 70. There was another Chinese brand in this list, which is higher. It went out of the list later, but remains a very formidable brand nonetheless. Now, the question is, can just putting one brand on Interbrand's list create such a favorable impression of a nation's capabilities? Yes. Take Nokia, for example. Who would have ever thought about Finland until they saw or used the Nokia brand, which is made in Finland, late in the 1990s? Very soon after, by the time the 21st century began, Nokia was featuring regularly on the list of the 100 most powerful brands in the world. And more than just Nokia, what this brand did for Finland or for the Made in Finland label was that it helped a lot of other Finnish brands get respectability. I'm sure most of you who have ever been into a multi-storied apartment would have at some times or the other used an elevator with the name Kone on it. That's from Finland too. And while not really a consumer brand, Wärtsilä is a brand name that most people in the shipping business understand because it's one of the most widely used brands of engines for merchant ships. Even Mexico contributes one powerful global brand, Corona, one of the most popular brands of beer across the world. So back to India and China. Why is it that India lags behind China, not only in terms of overall GDP, but even in terms of putting just one brand in the list of the world's 100 most powerful brands? I've talked to a lot of people about this, and the arguments that I've heard, let me share them with you and give you my opinion about whether these arguments hold or not. Now, there are some parallels to India and China. Both of them gained independence, reorganized their politics at around the same time, 1950. Both of them realized that they had the world's largest populations to feed. And even though industrialization was critical for becoming great economic powers again, the first priority was to feed their hungry billions. So agriculture was priority number one. What China did was, by removing private ownership of either business or land, they built communes, pretty much in the Russian style. All property was state-owned. And what this did was create very large farm holdings, which make agriculture, especially farm mechanization, far more efficient. India tried to do pretty much the same thing, but in a sort of a 50-50 manner. What they did was land redistribution amongst people. And unfortunately, what this did was to create large amounts of fragmented holdings, very small holdings with a very large number of farmers. So it's equitable, yes, but as we said, farm mechanization works best on larger scales. And talking about China, communism came in to remove feudalism. India tried to do the same thing, but large feudal landlords held sway as ministers, political leaders for quite some time in India's history. Another argument, or a corollary to the earlier one, is that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't have to think about going to the polls every 4 or 5 years to win people's confidence, and thereby being able to get the continuity required for rebuilding an entire nation. Now, India was a democracy, having to go back to the elections every 5 years, but much better off then another example we could take of a democracy, which is Italy. Right after World War II, Italy was plagued by a series of coalition governments. No one party was able to get a majority, and the usual tug of war happened. People couldn't agree on a single goal, people couldn't agree on a single direction, and Italy's economy, as a result, suffered greatly. So while Italy proves the case that democracies are sometimes not as strong as totalitarian regimes in delivering to a long-term vision, let's take the case of North Korea. It has a totalitarian system, and economically, it's a basket case compared to its cousin, South Korea, which may not be in the G7, but in terms of standard of living and GDP per capita, it's pretty close. But the clincher, I would say, would be the G7 nations themselves. Every one of them is a democracy. In fact, the United States goes to polls every 4 years, as compared to India, which goes to polls every 5 years, or as does the UK. So I don't think that any one philosophy of politics per se can be held as a guarantor of economic progress or of building brands. What do you think? Let me know. So how did India as a democratic country function with respect to agriculture as compared to China, which was a totalitarian state and ran what are called state-owned farms or communes? I don't have statistics at hand to show whether China was dependent on aid for food, but I do know that until the mid-1970s, India was a recipient of food aid from across the world from the more evolved economies. In fact, in terms of know-how, it was scientists like Dr. Norman Borlaug who came here and helped revolutionize our agricultural systems and gave birth to what is called the Green Revolution, after which India did not need food aid again. Back to industrialization. India and China, despite their different political systems, went about it in pretty similar ways, in the sense that there were no private-owned businesses in China. In India there were, but the public sector was the one in which huge investments were made to create the heavy industry infrastructure that helps private businesses succeed. By about the late 70s or 1980s, China and India both realized that the public sector was not capable of accelerating the pace of industrialization, and more important, was very weak in creating what are called market economy. So by 1980, to accelerate the pace of industrialization and market reforms, China took a giant step. From being a closed nation, it opened its doors to the world. And the symbol was a meeting between Chairman Mao Zedong and the first time ever American president to visit China, which was Richard Nixon. This happened in the 1980s. What this meeting led to was a rapid reorganization of China's systems of doing business, of economics, and of shifting the burden of industrial growth as well as a market economy to the private sector. So China, a communist regime, actually started adopting certain capitalist marketing principles. China opened its doors to the world and invited every leading manufacturing organization across the world, especially those from countries with higher technologies, to come and set up shop and manufacture. So after China opened its doors to the world in 1990, what happened? Not only did Chinese manufacturers fabricating for foreign brands acquire the know-how and the technology for making superior products, the Chinese government also incentivized local businessmen with subsidies to make similar products at cheaper prices and win orders at all costs. The result was that apart from seeing the Made in China label on prestigious foreign brands, consumers also started seeing the Made in China label on sometimes unpronounceable Chinese brands, be they batteries, be it lubricants, be it umbrellas, ceiling fans, what have you. Whether it was Harrods in England, or Walmart in the US, or Carrefour in France, the store shelves across the world were flooded with made in China products, and a lot of them from Chinese brands. So that was where the made in China epoch began. That's it for part 1 of this episode. And part 2, coming up next, will focus on Make in India. If you like this episode, please do hit the like and subscribe button, share it with people who you think may be interested in it, and ring the notification bell in case you want to be informed about the next episode when it comes up on air. Finally, don't forget to put your comments and suggestions in the section below.